Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the Stark Reflections Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, and in today's episode I have a chat with Dana Pharant about her new book, The Inner Dominatrix Guide, Become a Badass in Business. You might remember Dana from episode 30 of this podcast. In that episode, titled Target Markets and Relationships, I chatted with both Dana and Barb Stillmer. This time, Dana is back for a solo chat with me. Dana Pharant is a business owner, a speaker, and author, and the host of the Inner Dominatrix Podcast, where she shares insights into how people can be the leader in their business by owning that space by becoming the dominatrix in their business. I was a guest on episode 77 of Dana's podcast several months ago, where she spoke to me about the transition that I was in the middle of just as I was leaving Kobo and striking off on my own to do things like writing full-time, in this podcast, and offering my professional services as a coach and consultant direct to authors and publishers. Before we get on with the interview, I wanted to share a little bit of a personal update. Very first personal update, and it's very, very personal, is our cat Atticus chewed through the wires of my headset, which was very frustrating because it was a very expensive headset with a good microphone that I use for recording the podcast and doing a lot of business. So I hadn't been able to use that. And then I went to Best Buy and I bought this headset that was even more expensive. It was another $15. So it was in the $50, $60 range as opposed to $40, $50 range. And I've had it, and I was using it as a headset for earphones, and it was great. But then when I went to actually use the microphone this morning, I found out that the microphone doesn't work, so I have to take it back. So right now I'm borrowing my son's really expensive gaming headset to do the recording, because that was the best thing I did. When I first tried recording it just using the audio from the computer, it was terrible and not anything I could clean up. Anyways, that's an aside. But hey, just like you, sometimes there's other things that kind of mess things up along the way. Atticus is still hiding because he knows he did bad when he chewed through my cord. But that's what animals sometimes do. One of the other updates is related to a podcast I listen to. So one of the many podcasts that I listen to on a weekly basis is Joanna Penn's The Creative Penn podcast. And last week, or was it this week, earlier this week? I can't keep track. In any case, in a recent episode, she interviewed Kinga Jantenix from Publish Drive. Now, I've known of Publish Drive and of Kinga through digital publishing circles for the past several years, but it was always one of those platforms that I made a note of and I put it on my I should check this out list, and I never got around to it. Just like there's so many things that you plan on doing and you never get around to. Joanna's interview with Kinga really inspiring, and so almost immediately listening to their chat, I went and I created a Publish Drive account, and I published 2 of my books just to test the system out. Well, I have to tell you that I've always held the amazing and user-friendly platform of Draft to Digital in high regard, and I still do. It's an amazing and user-friendly platform, but there is something truly amazing about the Publish Drive system, and kind of gives Draft to Digital a bit of a run for their money in terms of that friendliness and approach. Now, not only is the interface simple and intuitive to use, just like Draft to Digital, it has additional features that nobody else out there that I've ever used employs, such as they pull the metadata right out of the EPUB file. So the EPUB file is one of the first steps you do, and they pull the metadata that's embedded in the EPUB file, and they automatically fill that out for you, and they ask you to approve it and modify it if necessary. But when it's correct, it saves the user from having to re-enter so many pieces of information. And that is absolutely brilliant, and huge kudos to Publish Drive for doing that. I'm surprised other people aren't doing that because the EPUB file itself has so much metadata embedded in it when it's created properly. Now, if you aren't publishing to Google Play already, and if you don't have an account with Google Play, which is almost impossible now, Publish Drive makes that simple and easy for you. Now, I've long had a Google Play account, which is probably one of the reasons I didn't put Publish Drive higher up on my list. So I don't need Publish Drive to get into Google Play, but I am using them to publish my books to a whole bunch of other global platforms, including ones in China and other Asian markets. I'll have some screenshots for this in the show notes at starkreflections.ca so you can kind of see the user-friendly, intuitive formatting, and then even the per imprint, the way you can, deselect, Kobo and Kindle and the other places that I'm already going direct to, or I'm using, for example, Draft to Digital or Smashwords, etc., to get into. So there'll be a link to that, and there'll also be a link to the interview of episode 391 of the Creative Pen podcast, in which Kinga is interviewed by Joanna. And you'll find that at starkreflections.ca. Now, in other news, my buddy Sean Costello and I are submitting requests to have audiobooks made for a couple of his titles through Findaway Voices. Just for those who don't know, I've been working collaboratively with Sean for several years. He was a writing mentor to me, and I'm his digital mentor, and a lot of his digital publishing is done collaboratively, where I do most of the work. He's the talent writer. I'm allegedly the talent digital publishing guru. So for this, with Findaway Voices, it was so simple. We simply went into our account on Draft to Digital, we clicked a button, that imported a good percentage of our metadata over to Findaway Voices. Again, like that Publish Drive system, we didn't have to rekey it in. Then we just had to answer a few simple, sort of tutorial questions, about the type of style of the book and maybe nuances about the narrator, their age, etc. And now we wait for one of the project managers to respond and provide a choice of voice talents from their worldwide pool of folks that are best suited for this project based on the data that we've entered. So we can then listen to samples of them. Usually there's 3 to 5 or something like that in different price ranges. And so we can listen to them and move on to the next step. Now, it'll be really interesting to do this in collaboration with Sean, as I've only ever done it on my own. And so doing it with a second person will be really fascinating because, on the other publishing projects, we sort of debate about different things and we fight like an old couple over some of the things. So it'll be really fascinating as we debate on the audio and the narrator choice and stuff like that, because we do have different tastes, even though we have similar tastes. Now, Findaway Voices is the sponsor for this episode, and you can find out more about how you could use Findaway Voices in a similar fashion and use their audiobook services, and you can find out more about them at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. Speaking of sponsors, I also wanted to thank new patrons to the show with a huge shout out to Joanna Penn, yes, the aforementioned Joanna, hey Joe, and Ellie Ash. Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you so much, Ellie. And thank you to all my existing patrons for your support, which demonstrates that you value the content I'm providing every week. I'm honored and I'm extremely thankful to all patrons, as well as to all listeners who continue to follow along on this weekly writing and publishing journey. Just a reminder that for as little as a coffee a month, you can become a patron and also get access to the additional 15 unique posts and things like videos and presentations and documents available with more always coming. And you can check that out at patreon.com/starkreflections. But that's enough about my anxiety over what things the cat has chewed this week, over my excitement about Publish Drive and my excitement about working with Sean on audiobooks with Findaway Voices. You probably want to get on to the interview with Dana. Hey, Dana, thanks for joining me again on the podcast. Welcome back.
Mark, it is always a delight to spend time with you.
So I'm pretty pumped about this forthcoming book that you're going to be releasing. I know, and I just finished reading it, and I walked away feeling more empowered, more enlightened, and it's given me some great ideas. But I'm sure that our listeners will want to hear about it. What's the title of your book?
So this is a bit catchy. It's the Inner Dominatrix Guide to Becoming a Badass in Business.
Okay. So for the listeners, where did this inner dominatrix come from? Before we
Yeah.
get to badass.
Before we get to badass, well, yeah, because the dominatrix word, of course, is very catchy. It's like, what? It really makes you stop. But to give the story, so I actually was a dominatrix for about a 6 year window in my life.
Okay.
And there's a story leading up to that. So, it's kind of unusual, but that was the dungeon, and getting involved in kink was one of the most profound ways that I found healing from the trauma that I experienced early on in my life. And it seems like an incredible juxtaposition where, it's like, really, you're going to go somewhere that looks really abusive on the outside, and yet that's healing. But the reality is that inside of a scene, and we call them scenes because it's not necessarily about sex.
Okay.
In fact, it's often not. Inside of a scene, you discuss with the person that you're playing with what you want to create, what do you want to explore, what do you want to do, and within that, there's the ability to create a different outcome. So you can reenact something and have a different outcome, which allows you to untangle things in a really deep way. So that's the first premise that I want to put out, is that, and that, so when I moved into becoming a dominatrix, that was also my big pull, was that I wanted people to experience this deep level healing in a container that was profound. But what happened for me personally was that stepping into that challenged me like nothing else. You really have to step up in the way that you're being so present, because you have to be fully aware of what's going on in every second. And you need to be really focused on what's going on with them, while at the same time holding this container of power and, space, authority, so that they have the ability to surrender. So that's the first piece of it. And then it's a fairly long story. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. This is a good backstory so people can understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. So then when I went through a bankruptcy in my business, so I had a 7-figure business, and we hit a wall, we hit a bankruptcy. Going through that, I realized that the thing that was missing was this ability to lead. I wasn't bringing all of that dominatrix energy into my business. I wasn't being the leader. I wasn't holding the space in the container for everyone there. And so it fell apart. And this is where the inner dominatrix comes in. I know it's a long story to get there, but thanks for staying with me. That piece of realizing that business owners need to also step into this authority and holding the power, holding the container, and also being extremely client focused in a way that allows them to propel their businesses forward.
Okay.
So
well, that is cool.
Yeah, that birthed the inner dominatrix.
And that's the inner dominatrix. Okay, so I have to ask then, are there parallels to that inner dominatrix, or to being a dominatrix and being an author? Because you just finished writing this book, and I know you've written previous books.
What a great question. I hadn't actually made that connection, but now that I think about it, yeah, there is a bit of that, because you have to take that person on that journey. And in a way, when you're writing, you're in control. You're in control of where the story goes, how they go on that journey. And then there's that responsibility to make sure that the journey they go on is what they're looking for, and that they get something out of it. So, interesting question.
It's because when you talked about scene and you were describing that, it's the scene and the roles and stuff, I'm thinking it was like character setting, like you're setting up all of these things. And I know you don't write fiction, you write nonfiction, motivational, self-improvement fiction. So what are we've got the inner dominatrix part, which is your brand, which, for your podcast and your consultation and coaching business. But then you've got being a badass in business. So where does the badass come from? Is it related to dominatrix and the power?
It is. And I mean, reality is there's also a bit of the badass. That word is very catchy right now. It's very popular. And so I'm capitalizing on that theme. And I also think it puts people into an energy. It's like if you think about who's a badass, right? It's like somebody who's going for it. They are not apologizing. They're just gonna get out there and go for their dream in a way that really works. But a badass is not somebody that like runs people over. They're just like, I'm just out there and I am doing it. I am kicking butt, taking names and no prisoners. You know? And I think for a lot of people in business, entrepreneurs, and I think, particularly authors and any artists, like creative people, tend to shrink back from really showing up as an authority in business, the business side of things. Maybe they really kick ass when they're on stage performing or while they're writing, but when it comes to doing the marketing and promoting, that's where they really could learn to lean into their badass self.
Okay, cool. Now, you mentioned unapologetic, and I believe this is something that you recently had a bit of a transformation in terms of your approach. And I think it relates really, really well to something I remember you telling me about before is I guess the strength to say no to the things or the clients or the work that isn't necessarily in line. And so you stop apologizing for the things you're not.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a recent transformation, and yet it's not, because it's also a big part of this inner dominatrix theme, in that inside of the dungeon, the last thing you want to do is apologize. If you are, and I love using this analogy. So let's say you've got somebody tied up and you're whipping them and you happen to hit the wrong spot, because there are some spots on the body that you want to avoid, but you happen to accidentally hit the wrong spot. The last thing that the person tied up and blindfold wants to hear is oops. Okay? Like that is going to break the state immediately. And then you're like, what? Right? So then you're no longer trusting the person. You're no longer trusting that they have the scene under control. But instead, what we would do in those situations is, I meant to do that. And if you keep squirming, I'm going to hit you again.
Okay.
So making it their fault, so that, and it's not, because you want to make it their fault, but you want to stay in scene, stay in character.
Right, of course.
And that's what's important, is the outcome for the person. You don't want to break their state.
And that's a critical learning related to what you talked about. There's obviously is you don't want to show the oops. There will be oopses.
There will be oops. Yeah. And, if we're building, if you're building a business, if you're constantly like, oh, I'm so sorry. And, I don't mean to bother you. And can I, like everybody's like, oh, gross. But instead, when you're asking for things, let's say you're asking for a publisher to pick you up, if you stand in that power and you're unapologetic about what your talents are, you're much more likely to be picked up. So this ability to actually lean into being unapologetic, which fits into somebody else's brand who I've been recently helping with their book, but that piece, it helps you to move forward without making yourself wrong. And that's really more on my brand, is getting out of those loops and habits of making yourself wrong and doubting your abilities and second guessing yourself. All that stuff needs to just be kicked out of the space.
Okay, cool. Which is, it's a huge issue, obviously, that writers face, right? Self-doubt and, constantly looking and saying, well, it's not working for me. I'm no good. No one's ever going to want to read this.
Mm-hmm.
So there's embracing that power and pushing forward. What other core lessons are in the book? And I know they're based on your experience working with do you call them clients? What do you call the people that you work with?
Clients.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we could call them scum, but that's most people wouldn't get that reference, but
what's that reference?
Well, in the dungeon, part of the thing for a lot of people is degradation.
Oh, I see. Okay. So that was it. Okay. I was like, whoa, that's harsh.
I know, right? To the average person, they're like, what?
Scum.
Oh, what the heck? That doesn't seem very client-centered.
Okay. So what are some of the other lessons, because again, this is based on your experience of helping tons of clients over the years. What are some of the other lessons that people can expect to find in the book?
So a lot of it is in around what I call practical woo. So I'm very much energy based. I love the energy psychology tools. I love, shifting people around the mindset, but I like to give people really practical, easy tools that work consistently. So there's lots of those tools woven in. Um, Getting out of self-doubt, there's lots of tools for how to actually kick the doubt to the curb. And I think the other thing is the willingness to do it wrong, the willingness to lose it all. That's one of my big core pieces. And it's not necessarily, your first level, but I'll hold it out in that when we're willing to lose everything, when we're willing to do it wrong, then that's a big piece of loosening off this doubt, and you go for something bigger. Because if you're constantly trying to get it right, you have to stay small in order to control the things that you need to control to get it right. Although there's no getting it right, which is a whole nother topic.
Okay. I mean, it kind of falls in line with a lot of stuff that, I learned in upstart companies and, the high-tech corporate culture, which is fail fast and fail hard.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because it's never a failure. There's always something that you learn from it. I mean, even my epic going bankrupt, taking something 7 figures and going bankrupt would on the outside seem like a failure. And yet out of that, I have a great story to tell from the stage. I have learned how to create my Inner Dominatrix brand, which is growing by the day. There's so many things that has given me. It's shown me how much the financial system is actually BS. It's like, it's really given me a lot of gifts. So there's never actually a failure.
Okay, that's cool. So you mentioned, so you also speak. You also do speaking to groups, and I know you've got some forthcoming stuff. You've got the podcast as well. How do those layers of your brand as the Inner Dominatrix? How do they come together? How do you roll them all out and consistently across the brand?
So I would say, one of the things about consistency is that my messaging and what I teach is, 3 principles. 1, getting you out of the wrongness of you, so unlocking you from all your personal judgments. 2, teaching you how to connect with your intuition and follow it every single time the first time, right? Because your intuition's never wrong. And then the 3rd is being willing to lose it all. So those are my core foundations. And then I talk about those in every platform in some variation. Okay. So I'm always thinking about that as the overall. And then the actual mishmash of how do I make this work? Well, the podcast helps me to promote whatever events I've got going on. It helps me to direct people into the Facebook where I can interact with them a little more deeply. It helps people to, be directed to the website or emailing me, getting clients. And then, I would say they do all become interwoven when you think about having the puzzle pieces as a big puzzle, and that how do they interfit? And that's part of strategy and thinking long term.
All right. That's really, really cool. And so the book is going to be coming out very, very soon. What do you have planned? Do you have some stuff going on for book launches in the Toronto area?
I do. It's very exciting. So we've got the online launch, which is October 15th to 20th.
Okay.
And then on September 27th, it's actually in Barrie, not quite Toronto, but close.
For people from far away, that's I just know the big city.
So far. Okay, it's just up the highway. It's all good. So September 27th, I have a speaking engagement where I'm going to do the first soft launch of the book. So that'll be the first place that people can pick up a signed copy.
Oh, that's cool. And so where is the speaking engagement? Is it in case there's people in the area who are interested in going? Are there still tickets available?
There are still tickets available. I'm just thinking I'll give you a link that you can put in the show notes because it's kind of one of those long links.
Yeah, of course.
Or feel free to connect with me on Facebook. I'm the only Dana Pharant in the world, so it's really easy to find me.
Okay.
Awesome.
That's cool. And so just sort of one last question. So you work with a lot of entrepreneurs because a lot of the clients you work with are people who are starting their own business, and authors are entrepreneurs. So as an entrepreneur yourself and someone who's guided and helped so many others, what's some of your favorite advice to somebody who's wanting to do that, to actually be entrepreneurial?
Okay. So I can't just stick to one thing, but
Fair enough.
so because it's always a big picture, but I think that big picture is the piece. I think we need to be thinking about our businesses in terms of, how do I want this to look in 5 years? How do I want it to look in 10 years? And how do I want it to look in 20 or more? When we're planning on that bigger picture, it's a lot easier for us to start mapping out. And you talk about, how do I make all these pieces fit in? Well, I'm looking at a 20-year plan. And so it's not just about how do they fit today, it's how do they fit in 20 years. And I think as authors in particular, like I said, creative types, the biggest thing is that you guys are so good at your craft, and there needs to be an equal amount of effort into being comfortable with the business aspects, and particularly marketing, because that's what makes or breaks anybody.
Cool. Thank you. So can you please let my listeners know where they can find you and more about you online?
Absolutely. So if you want to go to innerdominatrix.com.
Easy enough. Awesome. And then they can find you in similar ways in Facebook and other social media.
Yeah, anywhere you want to Google Dana Pharant, which is Pharant.
Awesome. Thanks for coming back and joining me on the podcast, Dana. It was always enlightening.
My pleasure, Mark.
I love what Dana has to say about being unapologetic and stepping into authority. I think it's an important thing for writers to remember, particularly because we always tend to be hard on ourselves or to be our own worst critics. And that never helps. There's a great lesson in authority that my friend James A. Owen shares in a special session during Superstar's writing seminars, and he uses a tale about an experience he had with Eggs Benedict to get it across. Now, I won't spoil the story because it's truly told best by James, but the underlying message of his story is that you have to believe in the value of what you do in order for others to believe it too. False modesty, or downplaying your importance and the value that you and your writing or your craft brings to the world, is doing nobody any favors. Certainly not yourself. As James says, no one ever inspired anyone else to greatness by pretending to be less awesome than they really are. If you've written a story, a novel, nonfiction article, or book, whatever it is, no matter what it is, it's something that only you could have brought forth and into the world. It is uniquely something that you conjured out of thin air and put into very specific string of word after word after word to paint the picture of characters, or setting, or dialogue, or scene, or perhaps sharing some information and teaching something that you know and shared with the world. That's a pretty powerful thing. Most people think that they might write a book. Most people don't write a book. If you've written a book, if you've dedicated the time, energy, and expense to actually get the entire thing written, you've already achieved something that most people will never do in their lifetime. Consider that the next time you're down on yourself. You're already above the cut. You're already above the fold. Chances are that your writing, your story, the thing that you have created, crafted, and written will help somebody else. And that is powerful. You are powerful. You are a writer. Own this. Own who you are. Own how hard you have worked for this. You deserve it. Like Dana says, step into your authority. Like James says, believe in the value of what you are doing. Well, my dear reflectives, this draws episode 37 to a close. Again, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Thanks for joining me on this episode. We will catch you next week in episode 38. So until then, here's wishing you great writing and good reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.